So welcome. Thank you all for joining us today to the Learning Circle, and which is hosted by the Center for Excellence in Indigenous Health. I'd first like to acknowledge the unceded ancestral lands of the Musqueam people, for whose land we are currently hosting the session from. Also like to thank the First Nations Health Authority for generously funding the Learning Circle. I'd like to remind folks, if you've been here before, if you're new, that the Learning Circle is a place for sharing and learning, and some of the topics can be a bit emotionally sensitive or triggering, so please ensure that you look after yourselves today. If you need to talk to someone, make sure you talk to a friend or a trusted elder or a counselor or colleague. And so I'd also like to introduce myself now. My name is Melanie Rivers. I'm from the Squamish Nation, and my Statliam name is Amlamawit, which means medicine. And I've been working in Indigenous health for about 19 years now in various capacities. So, very, very pleased to welcome Dr. Patricia Vickers here today. She's the Director of Mental Wellness at the First Nations Health Authority. I've worked with Patricia for a few years now, and she has amazing ancestral teachings to share and keep us grounded in this work, grounded in culture. So I'll just read you her bio here. So she has experience as a trainer, consultant, instructor, facilitator, program developer, director, and clinical counselor for Indigenous communities along the coast of British Columbia. She is no stranger to public speaking, being published, and engaging families, professionals, youth, and the greater community. She has ancestral roots in Tsimshian and Heiltsuk nations on her father's side and English on her mother's side. Her interdisciplinary doctorate included researching through her traditional languages, the transformative aspect of ancestral law, which hold many answers to our queries about life, purpose, healing, and positive change. Her master's degree in educational psychology gave her an opportunity to study healing through Indigenous cultural teachings and ceremony. When there were no words to express the hope and truth in studies and experience, she feels that her painting became a necessity. So I want to welcome Patricia to share on this topic of trauma and soul retrieval. Trauma being an issue that's impacted many of our people, and complex issue to address. So to have some teachings to help us with that today. So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to start by praying a blessing on the Coast Salish communities and families for healing and wellness and wholeness. And I'm from the village of Gitcatla. My mother was adopted into the house of Gillisgamach by a man named Matthew Hill. She, as you'd mentioned, was an English woman. She went actually as a missionary, taught school, and was a field matron in Gitcatla in the early 40s. And so because she was adopted, I'm an eagle. I carry an eagle name. It is Tsokabdachsk. And it was given to me when we returned to Gitcatla to thank the people for their acceptance of my mother and for giving her a place in the community. So this, too soft. It's not the first time there's been that complaint about my voice. So this topic is something that let's say it came into focus for me. So I studied as a counselor, and I found that for both myself and the people that I worked with, that it was really difficult to get into the center for myself and as I worked with others. So what really helped was when I began to look at how do we bring together the cleansing ways that still exist with psychotherapy. And I began to do that intentionally when I was in Bella Coola. And Karen Anderson, who is from Bella Coola, was kind enough to translate for me as I spoke with the matriarchs there about how do you do your cleansing? What happens when a person has attempted suicide in their youth but they've never made peace with their family? How do you restore balance? And so that's where my learning begins. And so what I give to you has simply been given to me. And may what I give to you be good medicine. And anything that doesn't land in a good way, I hope that you let it roll off. So, is it the down arrow?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So first slide. So this is essentially what I've learned mainly through talking to elders over the last 20 years, starting looking at transformation, and then as a psychotherapist, asking these questions about how do we help people to heal. So soul loss. Our ancestors on the northwest coast of British Columbia believe that when a person experiences a traumatic event, such as a near drowning, that a part of their soul is lost. It breaks away and remains in the geographic location until healing is sought to retrieve the missing part of the soul. When we lose a part of self through trauma, through violence, through abuse or neglect, this is called soul loss. So what I did before I took trauma training and before I began to learn from the elders, I myself did not do the brushing. So as a psychotherapist, what I did before I began to learn about soul loss was altered state of consciousness work with people. So essentially, some people call it visualization. And at that time, I didn't understand that this was a part of soul loss, that through an altered state, a meditative state, you would guide a person back to when they were a child. It was also called inner child work. And what I found working with people is sometimes they would be wearing the color that they saw when they were a child, when the traumatic event happened. And so what they would do is have a dialogue with themselves as a child, and eventually come to a place out of being repulsed or feeling a distance from themselves to beginning to understand the bigger picture. So began to see themselves from an adult mind rather than a child mind. So maybe before I go much farther, I just want to give to you something that was given to me for self-regulation. So basically what you do is you clench one hand and you hold it for about a slow 1, 2, 3, and then you release, and the opposite hand for 1, 2, 3, and then you release, and then back. So what this does is it calms the nervous system. It's also called self-regulation. You can do it with your feet too, if you don't want to be really obvious that you're doing self-regulation. So in soul loss, what basically where a person's soul is in trauma training is called the vortex. In trauma training, they describe the impact of trauma as a dark place that is cyclic in nature. One is triggered by a sense of powerlessness, which pulls them back to the past. When referring to childhood abuse, the challenge is finding freedom from intergenerational shame. And that shame is rooted in silence and secrecy. So when we first approach looking at the fact that I've lost some part of me, the resistance is usually unconscious. That it's the shame and the secrecy around it that is like a barrier, basically. So once a person knows that and that it's simply energy, then you find the courage to go through it.
Do you want to ask any questions?
Or if there are any comments or questions?
Not yet.
Okay. Okay. So soul retrieval is the ability to return to the traumatic event to retrieve the missing part of self. Returning enables the soul, emotions, beliefs, and physiological experiences to become known. Returning enables the individual to bring together splintered parts of spirit, body, and mind. So I can say that for myself, the trauma in childhood, how that manifested itself in me was the imbalance, was judging. And judging others really was about this, how I felt, the self-loathing towards self. So, and it wasn't a comfortable thing to do. Very uncomfortable, but it's a sign of really of soul loss, that I'm missing that sacred connection with self. Also for me was rage, that whenever in the earlier slide, the vortex and the cyclic nature, that's about I have an experience of powerlessness. So as a mother, I was constantly facing powerlessness, and it was frustrating. And there were times when I would rage, and then I would have shame about that rage. So there's the coupling of shame and rage. Also, a sign of not having my whole self.
Do we have a question? Just these things about the slides. We got the slides on the right one now. Okay, so question. So from Anita, when working with individuals who appear to have lost their soul and working to retrieve their soul, What if the individual doesn't know at the time the exact moment his or her soul was lost?
The question is perfect for what we're going into next. And so essentially, it's family. It's the responsibility of family to recognize a soul loss, to recognize that a traumatic event has happened. So I heard stories that often it was the grandmothers. They were the ones who were watching out for the family. And in Bella Coola, it was the women who knew. In my home community of Gitcatla, when a family member went through a traumatic event, again, it was the women who stepped forward and did what needed to be done. So, so traditionally, it's family who recognizes that a person isn't balanced, and then it's family then who would find someone who could help, maybe within the family or within the house. So in this next slide, essentially that's what this slide is about. The presence of house, tribe, matriarchs, and chiefs in guiding and supporting healing and spiritual balance reminds the one who suffers that they belong to a greater order. And I know for me, this was most significant. So earlier, Davina was talking about culture and language and how that sense of belonging has done a lot for students in the Nass Valley. And I can say that it did a lot for me. So as soon as I attended the first feast, it was in Gitxsan territory, I got in one evening the depth and the complexity and the simplicity of the feast and of ceremony. There was so much that happened within about 8 hours. So, but what really struck me was, I think when it came home to me was when my father died. And so my father was killer whale, my mother eagle were not of the same tribe. And so when he died, the killer whales asked us, myself and siblings, what we wanted in the way of the preparations, what were our plans. And so we told the chiefs, and they agreed, and they said it was a good plan. And we were really distraught because our father didn't get the help that he needed. And so some of the elders from home would say he died a troubled man. So we were really hurting. It was very painful. And one of the killer whales said to us, right now you're all like a canoe that's tipped over on its side. Mm-hmm. And we're here as your boulders to hold you up. And it went beyond belonging for me to hear that. It was this knowledge that my father was a killer whale, and that means that I'll always have support there, even though my father's gone. Mm-hmm. So of course this has been disrupted by Indian residential schools. And so I said earlier, it's the families' responsibility to watch out for every member. But for myself, I didn't have anyone to say what you experienced was trauma. Mm-hmm. And you're missing parts of yourself. Mm-hmm. That's why you're so angry. Mm-hmm. So I went through treatment in the States, and then I did trauma training, but it wasn't until I went to the elders and I began to ask questions about healing and about shame and about what does spiritual balance mean, that I began to learn about. One story was that a man had fallen overboard when he was fishing and almost drowned. And when he returned, they noticed, and they would be the elders, that he wasn't quite right. He was forgetting things. He wasn't present in conversations. He was making mistakes. I don't know what else. So what they did was they said to him, when you almost drowned, you lost a part of yourself, and we're going to help you get it back. Mm-hmm. And they took him to the place where he almost drowned, and they told him, we're going to put you back in the water so you can get that part of yourself back again. And I think what's powerful about that is that there were people who believed that spiritually he was going to experience healing. And I know that that is an important part of our healing, as individuals and as families.
We have more questions.
Okay.
Is soul retrieval a unique experience for a specific trauma, or is it a continuous process that needs to be done either for a determined or undetermined time?
Great question. I think really answered your question. That's how I experience it for myself personally, and working with people, that especially if you've experienced what we call complex trauma, which is repeated trauma throughout childhood, with few resources, then what you're looking at is layers, or this splitting in the brain and these different pathways. So I would agree that it's a continuous process. And really that none of us arrive.
Yeah, that's right.
So,
yep. And a question from Ashraf. So when you go into a place of rage or shame, what are some practical tips to overcome it in day-to-day life?
Well, I think the first thing is non-judgment. And because the shame itself generally takes one into a dark place. The other thing is that our emotions are guides. So if I take the time to sit with anger, then that anger is going to lead me usually to some event in the past. So, and usually anger is around an injustice that's happened. And the gift of anger is strength. So anger is opposed to rage. So rage has shame and a deep sense of powerlessness. Yeah.
And another question, will you be delving further into the idea of going back to trauma?
I'm not sure what they mean by that question.
So Jerry Lynn, you want to explain a little bit further what you mean by your question? Maybe going back to the time when the trauma happened? As we wait for that, there is another question. So what is the connection between trauma and lateral violence in workplaces, and how can we approach this?
I think that, when I think of, I'll use myself as an example. So I said that I struggled with judgment, and I think judgment is lateral violence. Whether I think it or whether I say it. I'm inviting shame into the space when I do that. And so it's going to create distortion immediately as soon as it comes into the space. So I think the awareness is the first step. And for me, it's recognizing that I need to find compassion for myself and non-judgment for myself first. Then I can be present with someone who is judging another person. And it's amazing what compassionate presence can do. No words spoken, no teaching, just being. So if you're the one who's maybe raging or in non-judgment, if I can be here with you in that moment, then really I'm being with myself. And so I think it always comes back to, again, what spiritual balance is, and me having these sacred parts of my soul in me. I'm able to do that because of retrieving this part of myself and integrating it back into me.
So Jerry Lynn said you did answer her question already. There's another question here from Cindy. So what if someone has been removed or has removed themselves as an adult? What can we do for them when we know they are really out of balance and experiencing rage and even perpetuating violence against others? How can we help them recover soul?
I think it helps to name the reality. So, for example, in meditation, many teachers will say that you sit, and when thought comes, you just say thought. When a judgment comes, you just say judgment, and you don't attach yourself to it. So I think that that's naming it. That's why I gave that example in meditation. And so sometimes we need to name, if you're my sister, I need to name what I'm experiencing in the reality of our relationship. Again, in a way that isn't judging you,
right? But naming
your value,
naming what my behavior might be.
Right. Yeah. And so when I was in treatment, we learned that was a confrontation. So I might say something like, when I see you raging at your child, I feel sadness, I feel pain. So I might say just that, and nothing else. It really depends who that other person is, who's removed themselves. But isolation is a really big key too, right? With trauma and with shame, that it's a consequence.
People isolating themselves?
Yes. Yeah.
From Reba, can you talk more about rage? I understand it stems from profound powerlessness and ends up in deep shame. How does one stop raging?
I know. So for myself, I experienced incest throughout my childhood, and so I understand that the rage comes from that. It's rooted in that sense of dehumanization. So I think when one has an understanding of how their soul is lost, then that's like the first step, just to be with that and without any judgment. But I think that also going to it is about hope. It's about the belief that if I go there, something positive will happen. So for me, it was really small. It was a really small light. And I've witnessed others do it as a psychotherapist, and it's profound when the light first comes from the deep place and you see it come through their eyes, and it's amazing.
Yeah.
So I think having an understanding of what you've suffered in childhood is really that linking the powerlessness experienced in childhood with the rage. And always, you know, I apologize so many times as a mother, and it was I felt as though I was humiliating myself constantly. And even after I went through treatment, it took some time for that humiliation to shift to humility. But eventually it did. So, and that's no small thing.
No.
You know, that's like
Transformational.
it is. It's the supernatural force that always exists when we're looking at soul retrieval. There's that understanding that the supernatural is there to assist.
So Cindy said she meant when someone's completely removed, that she meant as in no communication with their community. So if they're not connected, say, to their house and tribe, or...
Right. And I for myself, the next slide is ceremony and ritual.
Oh, okay.
The sweat lodge is not a part of where I'm from, but it's something that helped me to begin to inquire into healing and cleansing ways from where I was from. I think that removing self from community, so I didn't grow up in Gitga'ka, and it took some time for me to understand what home means. Quite some time, because what was familiar to me was the shame. So I think again about if you're connected with someone who has removed themselves from community, it's for good reason that they've done that. And if you're someone that they can talk to, then that's wonderful, because you know, we all need somebody, at least one person that we can talk to with confidence that they respect us.
We still have more questions.
Okay.
Okay. So what about trauma experienced in a home or place you still live or lived in after the trauma? How does the soul recovery happen in this case?
Just think of some families that I worked with, and again, it's naming the reality that exists within the family, and the children are the first to do that. They'll say really clearly what the reality is in the family. And so my job as a psychotherapist was to help parents to hear that. And the reason that parents resist hearing that is because their children are basically taking their head and forcing them to look at their childhood. So, and then we're talking about intergenerational trauma and intergenerational soul loss.
Yeah, Deborah was asking if you could discuss a little more about soul retrieval with children.
Yeah, it's simple.
Children, they get it faster than adults, don't they?
They do. I can think of a story that I was told by a friend of mine where they were children, and the one boy was riding his bike, and his pant leg got caught in the chain, and he went off the dock and into the water. And so the one boy who witnessed this went into the water and rescued him. So what the family did for the child who had the accident was they burned his clothes that he was wearing, and they acknowledged that he had a near-death experience. That was important for the child. And then by burning his clothes, they were teaching him that energy was no longer on him, that near-death experience energy. And then that they invited others to come, and they gave out fruit and food so that everyone was acknowledging that this child had a near-death experience, but that he was living. And the boy who rescued him was given a whole basket of clothing, and he was acknowledged for his part in it all. So I see that, as you said, that children get it, and they when we practice these ways, they get it in a very deep, clear way.
So Cindy, clarifying her question again. So sorry I keep asking this question. I'm really asking, what can we do for people who are completely removed from community, who we cannot speak with, who is raging and violently hurting others? And that we have so many children in care and many people in prisons.
Well, I think what you're speaking to, when I was in the NAS, and I spoke to one of the chiefs there, and I said, well, in a circumstance like this, what would your grandparents have done? And they said, they would have taken him and put him in a house, and basically he would be in lockdown. And then the elders would go in 24/7 to speak to him, and basically what I would say is to help him see that a part of him is lost, that he's not whole, that he is causing harm, and would help him to see the impact of what it is that he's doing. So I think, what a powerful and beautiful way to help someone to understand where they're at and the consequences of where they're at. So I think that's why in our communities it's hopefully we're going to have these houses and elders who can help in circumstances like this.
So someone's so I just mentioned that the typing is a bit distracting. So apologies, we're still new with this system, so we're still working out all the bugs, so we'll continue to problem solve. Do you want more questions, or do you want to continue on at this point?
Well, I think just to say here, and maybe most of you already know this, the primary intention of ceremony is to cleanse the internal, so the heart, mind, soul, and external as well, so clearing negative energy from the outer body. Like the heartbeat, ceremony and ritual bring spiritual rhythm and order to life. So when they burned his clothes and when they gave away fruit, that also is ceremony. Maybe before the coherence slide.
Okay. I think maybe Cindy doesn't quite have an answer yet to her question. I think she's thinking about when you're not even able to be with someone that's experiencing rage. If I'm understanding correctly. So how do we help those people, or how can they be helped?
You have to get in there. There's no other way to do it. And if you're not the one, and if it's a family member, then you're not the one to do it. It's people who are trained to do it. And the family needs to be unified in that intervention. That's really important. So I can say that it's similar to my oldest brother, that he was an alcoholic, he had a lot of rage, And as a family, after my mother, my sister, and I went through a treatment program, we began to do just that, you know. And he was harsh. So whenever we'd approach him, but eventually he got to a place where he was going to blow his head off. And all that we'd said to him, our extension of love to him, and how treatment had helped us, that's what was in the front of his mind. And he went for help instead.
I guess the more programs that pay attention to trauma and have ceremony, find ways for people to belong, that there's be more opportunities to deal with soul loss.
Yes, yeah. And where we went through treatment was in Wickenburg, Arizona, and it's a different treatment program than what you'd find in BC. There was a lot of altered state of consciousness work. Now there's a great deal of trauma work that happens there, that they acknowledge sex addiction. They're basically going into the heart of what's happening in society, the distortions that are happening in society.
Yeah, Jacob says more cultural events and gatherings in urban settings, cultural involvement, family support and connection, focusing on healing, health and wellness and education, and increased sense of belonging and identity.
Right. And truth-telling, and truth-telling, and truth-telling.
Truth-telling, the hard one, yeah.
Yes, yeah.
So we got lots of questions and comments still. Okay. So Anita, so how do you balance the Indigenous view of the expert/healer giving direction and Western approach of not being the expert, not giving direction? I have learned much of our cultural healing is directive. I find these two beliefs conflict. At times I want to tell someone what to do with my training in cultural healing, but it conflicts with ethics and clinical counseling. I wonder if using a more directive approach with clients who don't have family support to tell them you are missing parts of yourself and you need to do this is needed more. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that I think of ceremony and how the 4 fasts that I've done are really a critical part, that in our teachings that stillness is important to listen, because sometimes I would agree it's important to be directive with people, and other times you know, it's just not time to be direct. And I would say you learn by mistakes. So, you know, I think of times when I've been direct, and then the next day or the next week the client comes back and says, hey, you pushed me way too hard. Like, that was scary.
And each person's going to be different.
Yes, yeah.
Do you see a role for digital or virtual connection to community, particularly for those removed or disconnected from timely understanding support? Digital or virtual connection to community.
Well, I think that's what we're doing today.
Mm-hmm. A little bit,
yeah. I think it's great to, you know, I can't see you, but to have this conversation and know that you're out there, because I can see the questions and the comments on Melanie's screen. So,
or virtual counseling, or
I'm not a big fan of virtual counseling at all. I think this presence is really it's really important, especially when you're working with complex trauma.
Can soul work prayer be effective for reaching those lost to the family? So
Definitely. Yeah. And listening.
And is there a way to work with a family in terms of soul retrieval? Can you work with a family unit in soul retrieval?
Yes. Yeah, that's what happened. I said my oldest brother, in his treatment program, all of us as a family, including our parents, were there for his family week, and basically what we did was we told him how we felt about his self-destructive behavior, and we listed the self-destructive. We were limited to 10. And there are 6 of us, so 8 including parents, so that would have been a lot for him to have to go through. So what they did is they asked us what we wanted as a family, and each of us were asked, and what I said is I want all the secrets out. And so then we were all asked if that's what we wanted. So then I'm a younger one in my family, so I had a better sense of what was going on in the whole family from the disclosures that happened over a period of 2 days. It was horrifying, but by the end of the week, it was like shame was all gathered together in a ball and just went out the door. It was and I've seen in the Gitsan at Kisan, that's what they do. They're gathering the noch all together and then throwing it out because it's causing havoc.
So Courtney was just responding to Cindy's question earlier. Just I understand part of your questioning. For example, if they are in prison, they can't return, and the whole community does not show up at prison. There will need to be different approaches and individuals that will help facilitate healing with self-compassion. And Marilyn, I'm curious, are you, Patricia, familiar or taken Aboriginal focused complex trauma therapy?
No. What I've had to do in somatic experiencing is translate, also address domination language. But for me, learning about the brain and the nervous system has been a really critical part, especially for my own healing from trauma, to know that the brain, trauma changes the brain, and that as we heal and retrieve our soul, our brain is healed.
Do you have experience working with trauma that people face in Canada due to immigration and separating from the bigger family and native land?
Most of my work has been done with Indigenous, but certainly there's, just in conversation with people, there are many similarities. We're human beings, after all. First, we're human beings.
Lorna's commented, so amazed by learning of soul loss and now have a greater understanding of the reason why I experienced what I did after a traumatic event. One of them is near drowning at the age of 10.
Yeah.
And she said, I saw a black dot on the wall, and as it grew bigger into a human figure, I feared it and cried and screamed, but I couldn't speak. I don't know how long it lasted, but I was fine after this experience.
Yeah. Thank you.
And Alan, can soul retrieval occur for individuals who are not aware of the source of their trauma, like a repressed memory? And can the work still be done?
One of the things that I've suffered from is dissociative amnesia. So there were certain traumatic events from childhood that I did remember, and then there were just parts that I remembered. So it's a way, it's a defense mechanism in order to survive the horror and the terror. So for myself, I've found that through neurofeedback therapy, it was really important for me to know. Because even though the rage was less, there was still an energy that was in me that now I understand that it's shame, and I just know myself and understand myself, in a way that I didn't before. So I would say that it is important to name it.
All right, we reached the end of the questions for now.
Right. So I'll finish with coherence. In somatic experiencing, trauma training, after the midway point in the 3-year training, we begin to identify coherence when it shows up in the nervous system and body. There is a relaxation and a softness of presence. The coherence is the resource, the strength and beauty that enables a person to survive repeated complex trauma. Coherence is a knowing that is beyond the mind, recognizing that you belong and matter simply because you're you, and you are connected to all beings. So coherence is something that we definitely have as children. I have worked with someone who grew up in the city, and what she did was she took her brother to the golf course and the bushes in the golf course. And that's where she found this coherence, this sense of safety and of a relationship with a force greater than herself. So over and over again, what I found is that individuals, they either went to the beach, or they had a dog, or there was a large rock at the lake. Over and over again, there was somewhere in nature that gave them the relationship that they needed. So that's about coherence. That's about the ability to connect.
So there's a comment here. So each culture has their own soul retrieval process, and who do we search out to follow up doing this? So I guess who could help them with soul?
So each culture meaning each nation?
They just said each culture.
Okay.
So probably nation.
Okay. Good question. I see that I'm familiar with the cultural support. It's out in Layla. And I'm just beginning to become familiar with the First Nations treatment centers. But I would say that essentially, even though they don't call it that, there is that knowledge. I also want to say that, so in soul loss, there's a facilitator or a practitioner, but also I went over this exercise, and there are also things that we can do, and Qigong has ways in which to clear energy. So other cultures have ways to balance as well, self, and to move energy, and as well as yoga. That's what they used on Hastings in the downtown east side, yoga and acupuncture in particular, and meditation.
And for Benita, are you familiar with possession after soul loss? I've experienced this with family and clients.
By possession meaning?
So Anita, can you clarify a little bit more what you mean by possession? Spirit possession.
Yes. I mean, it's a whole tricky area though, and I think why it's tricky is that you can have some people perhaps not seeing clearly, and I'll just say that much about it.
And elders are a great source of knowledge in our communities. When we learn of the healing process that was practiced by the elders, when we learn of them, we can begin to practice it so that these teachings are not lost.
Yes, yeah.
So much to be learned from our elders. And Elizabeth said, I used to leave my body.
Yeah. So, in psychotherapy, they call it dissociation. And we do it for different reasons, but when we're experiencing trauma, it's in order to survive it.
She said she went on a healing journey.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so are there any other questions, or maybe ones that I might have missed through our chat process there? Or comments? So from Cindy, I think that we all have to search out with our support person the safe space to do our soul work. And for me, living on the land and having accessible cultural ceremonies has helped me through my trauma. I also think that people need to explore their own wellness journey and what works best for them. I depend on my elders to keep me strong as well.
Yeah.
Crystal's asked if we have a copy of the slides. They'll be posted on the site. Any books that you would recommend on soul retrieval?
Oh, I know in the States they have a number out, but really everything that I've talked about has been in conversation. It's orally, that oral tradition. So I don't think anything's been written yet about it, at least how we understand it on the Northwest Coast.
Peter, I didn't quite understand your comment here, or your question, are there So maybe a typo? Or maybe songs?
Signs.
There's signs. Signs of trauma that we can identify for us as individual to help one another.
Yeah, I think it's become normalized. Our lack of presence in society really has been normalized, and everything that takes you into counseling. I think of all of the different people that I've seen. It's suffering, essentially, that cues one in, and patterns of suffering. So choosing the same mate over and over again, where there's disrespect, is a sign. Causing suffering in the lives of others is a sign. And
So from Shani, coherence connects you to yourself and to other beings. Is there a way to help one recognize that they matter? During a traumatic stage in one's life, and the rippling effects of trauma, it is hard for one to see that you matter. Maybe if you could give strategies or words to say to someone who's dealing with this discoherence.
Often what I've done when working with people or in my own life is allow for that stillness. And from the stillness comes the message. They're called core beliefs. So one of my core beliefs is that I don't matter. Another one of my core beliefs is that I can't get it right. Because repeatedly this horror has happened to me. So somehow I'm not able to get it right. I think what's important is that the core beliefs are from the mind of a child. And yet here I am as an adult, still living from beliefs that are from the mind of a child. When really what I need to do is take care of that child that holds those beliefs as a mother and as a grandmother.
Do you have any thoughts on the advent of screen culture and how it relates to trauma? We have recently been exposed to images of war, suffering, etc. via the internet, and that other generations have not. Any thoughts on this?
And I think about my mother and what her father said to her, and that's everything you see and hear, you're taking in, and so you have to be careful in what you read, what you watch, what you listen to, because it impacts you. That energy impacts you.
And from Marilyn, so first of all, I'm glad I'm here for this webinar, such valuable information, thank you. And her question, what if a community is filled with strife, division, addictions, and suicide? One I know personally is alarming. What would you suggest should be done in dealing with the suffering of this community?
Oh, there are many communities like that. And knowing that for myself, there are times when I just need to be still and release the pain that I feel about that. And I think that for me it can accumulate, because in my position I'm facing it constantly with communities throughout the province. And it's our state right now. We're in a suffering state, and we're suffering from collective soul loss. So, she's simply pointing to the fact that she sees that collective soul loss exists. So, what some people have mentioned here is culture, is language, is songs, is dances, and that is an important part of it, but it's not all of it. Also is truth-telling, and finding a way to do that isn't shaming, that isn't judging a person's value, but that is just truth-telling. This is what exists right now in my family. This is what's happening in the community. I think of a house that I often use that community as an example, where I believe it was the grandmothers or the mothers who said to the leadership, we've had enough of this, and we want you to do something, and we want you to come up with a plan now. And so they did, and they made some amazing steps. They created a 6-month treatment program and they identified the bootleggers and the drug dealers in their community, and they gave them an ultimatum. And it was to go through cultural rehabilitation and treatment, or to be banished from the community. So, and it was a positive decision, but then how do you sustain that? And that's where we're at, really. We're coming out of freeze state, and we're seeing, we're noticing what's happened and where we are.
From Peter, so do we see it coming through laughter and healing?
Definitely. Humor.
And Vanessa, so in my work, an important part of trauma healing is for people to feel safe in the present moment, although there may have been important moments when they haven't felt that in the past. However, I've found that many people struggle to feel safe given ongoing structural violence, difficulty finding financial security, meaningful work in a broken economy, inability to find housing, and ongoing colonization of land and peoples. How can we help people feel safe in this context and not internalize systemic problems?
I think of working with men when I was with the Aboriginal Wellness Program when it existed on 12th with Vancouver Coastal Health, and they were it was part of their probation, so they came to see me, and what I saw, she basically described their reality, and what I saw happen, I started SE training, what I saw happen was, as I described to them what was happening to their nervous system when they were threatened, they began to recognize what a threat was and that they were raging, whereas before they wouldn't have had a name for their behavior, just knew that it was troubling. So I saw significant change happen in 3 months just by giving them information. Of course, it was information at a time when they were looking for it and they wanted answers.
So for Ryan, when you begin your healing journey, how do you navigate ongoing relationships with those who have perpetuated the trauma? Can you keep them in your life?
I can't really say for anyone else. With myself, I had to separate and be in no communication with my father for a full year, and to acknowledge that it was hatred that I felt, to acknowledge that I wanted to kill him, that I had to just keep telling the truth, and then eventually to see the harm that my hatred was causing his grandchildren, my children, and then to pray for how do I move from here. So I think that it's really up to an individual what they choose, because I think it's important to set boundaries and to take care of yourself, and that one knows when they're just at overwhelm. Yeah.
So from Cindy, even in our workplaces, we experience trauma and want to help and see that some people feel ashamed and do not want to address the pain, and we just keep moving on, and so many mistakes are made, and not always by choice. How do we change the communication to protect people from further suffering? It is sad to see that we can do nothing immediately. It takes time to break through, and time can cause more pain. We want to take care of people, yet they have work responsibilities and are being challenged by their own personal trauma that can be perceived as negative for those who are unaware and are non-tolerant in the workplace. I believe that the honor of one is the honor of all comes to mind.
I think too it comes back to the question earlier, and that's around boundaries and how important it is to have boundaries. And as a practitioner, I never saw myself as protecting anyone. The only ones that I see about protecting are my children when they were children. Now they're adults, and now that's their job to protect themselves. I can draw attention to the fact that someone's not working their boundaries, but it's really up to you.
Right.
You know, if I point it out, because I can't.
Can't do that work for me.
No, no.
Is there a possibility to bring the program developed in a house it to adapt for other communities?
Definitely.
So collective soul loss affects all peoples. What can one do to create awareness so that unity comes from a loving, respectful place?
I think that we continue this conversation. I think I really appreciate being here and having this opportunity to have this conversation. I think that we need to sustain it. And to acknowledge the coherence that exists, because it's so easy to focus on the trauma and the loss and the horror and the terror, and not say, hey, and there's this going on,
which is the real truth, right? That coherence. So what can one do about a community that rejects marginalized people out of fear?
That
rejects marginalized people out of fear?
I think it just comes to to naming it. Well, really depending on who's in power, right?
And have you had any challenges in terms of reconciling these teachings with religious teachings? I come from a really religious community, and leadership seems to pull away from anything that doesn't come directly from the Bible.
I have had challenges, and it's taken me a while to understand it. I think for myself, one of the challenges is that at first I was taught by my mother that these healing ways, the sweat lodge and fasting, contradicted with Christianity. But then I grew to understand that she was really talking about the institution of the church. And the more I looked at the teachings of Christ, the more I saw that they were actually congruent. That we look at him going out on the land so many times throughout his life to pray and to be still, to renew, to regenerate. But, you know, in the institution of the church, that's not really discussed. But as I was going more to land-based ceremony, that's what I saw more and more.
So we've had a thank you for sharing these teachings, and yes, thank you. These are incredible conversation and so many valuable teachings. I would love recommendations of resources, videos, articles, books, etc. on this topic if possible.
Probably videos mostly.
Yeah. So we'll see if we can get some added to the page after. And so Jacob, Bella Bella, where I'm from, has a culture, science and land-based summer camp for kids. I find this is a good way to nurture identity in our children and to become more aware of our relationship, sustenance and stewardship responsibilities with the land. It would be awesome to see more of these types of camps around the province. I think this also has had a profound effect on high school camp counselors as well, as many of us have gone on to post-secondary endeavors that are a benefit of our nation and communities we work and reside in. I think it is an aspect of our community that helps our community heal from its past traumas. Great. And a thank you from Anita and UBC, Anita, thank you to UBC and Dr. Vickers for the presentation. It means much for those of us in remote communities. And we've got a question here in the question box here too. So if mental illness creates family trauma, how would soul retrieval play out in this scenario? So mental illness causing family trauma.
So what you're speaking from is a disease model. And so I think the question would be more in a disease model. We're looking at treatment. We're also generally looking at power imbalances. So it's the domination language that I found in SE. It's about me creating space for you. It's about me holding space for you, when that isn't actually what happens. There's a space here and you and I enter into it. So I think that it's difficult to bring a disease model together with a healing model. It's challenging to do that.
Okay. Some people had lack of power in where they're located, so they're grateful to have caught the second part. We will be posting the video afterwards too, if people miss some of it. Got someone from the Yukon dialed in. So we just have a few more minutes. So are there any other questions or comments for Patricia? Or from you?
I'm done.
Or for her? Southern Inuk?
Hmm.
Yeah.
Wow.
listening from the First Nations Health and Social Secretariat of Manitoba.
Oh, wonderful.
And thank you, I appreciate addressing this and hope more will take time for this.
And one from the Yukon.
Yukon, okay. Haida Gwaii. I love seeing where everyone's from. Chilliwack.
Alona Izak had a comment.
Oh, was there a comment? And then I missed you.
From my edge.
Okay, there we are.
Yeah.
Aboriginal people are very spiritual beings. Our ancestors, sorry, it scrolled down on me. Our ancestors accepted the religion brought by Europeans because our people related so much to it. We have been able to bring the two together because of the similarities. Thank you, Patricia, for your teachings. And lots of thank yous coming in. Nelson, Victoria, FNHA family on the 6th floor.
All right.
Okay, well, really like to thank everyone for participating today and from near and far. Thank the team. It's helped us get the session set up and problem solve with technical challenges. I'd really like to thank Patricia for coming and sharing these real teachings and these wise teachings that have so much to offer to our communities. So hope you all join us again to keep an eye on our webpage for upcoming sessions. And again, thank you, Patricia, for sharing.
Yeah.
And hope everyone has a great day today.